So Ovid, a Roman poet in the first century, around 8 CE. He wrote a collection of stories and myths. They traced between the beginning of time, so creation stories, until the death of Julius Caesar in 44 BCE, which happens also to be 1 year after Ovid was born. So Ovid, well, actually, that's a good question. I'm not quite sure if he named it this, but we know of these stories now as his book of transformations, otherwise known in English as the Metamorphoses. So I didn't travel to Greece. I didn't travel to Italy or even the Black Sea, where Ovid was in exile when his book was actually distributed in the Roman Empire. And I wasn't thinking about the Metamorphoses when I made these photographs in Chile in 1998 and 1999. In a similar vein, Ovid, during his time when his book came out, he wouldn't have even known that the New World existed, let alone a land that would later come to be called Chile. So fast forward, in summer of 2020, I was on the phone with one of my dearest friends, Mara Zepeda, who's here tonight. And we grew up in Santa Fe together. At the time when we were on the phone, Mara was living in Washington with her husband, Andrew Berns, who you'll be introduced to, who has a very special relationship to this project. So I was describing to Mara this work that I had been doing for about the last year, scanning over 1,500 negatives from Chile and reading the over 250 stories that Ovid wrote about, and finding one in the other, which is to say, finding the photographs in the language and the language in the photographs. By the time Mara and I were speaking, I had distilled about, well, actually, a total of 29 of these stories into an essence and had paired image with line of poetry. It was then that Mara let me know that Andrew, at that very moment, was reading the Metamorphoses, Ovid's Metamorphoses, not in English, in an English translation like I had been, but in Latin, for pleasure. So this is a very unique mind we have in our midst. And it's something I didn't know about Andrew and has been such a pleasure to experience and really, just experience fully. So it was with the encouragement of our partners, and it was David's idea in the first place to ask Andrew if he would like to do a new translation. So I've always admired Andrew's inquisitive and very thoughtful mind as a friend and as a historian. And now I admire it even more as a collaborator and a translator of Latin poetry. So this project began as a book. You'll see it's taken on an evolution. Last summer, and actually in the spring, we've done 2 different iterations of how to share it with an audience live. But I'd like to just mention that Ovid is not sentimental. His stories are very difficult. They touch on subjects of murder and rape, incest, greed, and then depending on how you're oriented, on the lighter side, the transmogrification of the soul, vegetarianism, the fates, very complicated mercies by even more complicated gods. So this, well, I don't know if it led to that, but I messed with the myths. I wasn't concerned with staying consistent with gender. You'll see where it says he, I might have introduced a she. What's more important will be some word like grass, and that's our touch point. And in this same way, the myths messed with the photographs. Prior to this structure, I didn't know what the photographs were. And then, in addition, the photographs messed with Andrew's translation. And he'll speak about this a bit after we watch the film, that the process of translation and his own academic training were challenged by working in this method. So I imagine that you understand that when I say messed with, I mean it in the best possible way. And in that spirit of messing around, I'd like to introduce Justin Ray. Justin has added another layer, another complication to the translation through sound and music. So Justin is owner of Remix Audio Lab here in Santa Fe downtown, and a veteran DJ and a deep listener. And when I brought the project to him to just do an event like this in his space, something about it resonated for him, and we have since now started collaborating as well through these live sonic interpretations of the myths. So I think that's it, that I will let you take it away. So think about, afterwards we'll have a conversation. This is also the premiere of this film. So I should say we recorded, Andrew and I recorded us narrating, and that's all scripted. And then Justin is playing live. All right, thanks, enjoy.
There, where Mount Parnassus scratches the sky, the only land not drowned by the sea, Deucalion and his partner blow ashore in their little skiff. When Jove scanned the liquid world and saw only one man and one woman remained from those who were once thousands, he banished the clouds and had the north wind carry them away. But now the fate of humankind depends on the two of us. O Themis, tell us how we may restore our ruined human race. As you depart, throw behind you the bones of your great mother. They toss stones behind them as the goddess ordered. Mineral begins to shed its hardness. Though not yet human, no longer rock. What was solid and would not bend became bone. Veins remained the same. Hence the hardness of our race, our experience of toil. We are the documents of our gritty origins. You'll meet a heifer in the countryside. Follow her and build your city where she settles in the grass. Cadmus kissed this unknown land. He ordered his boys to find fountains of fresh water. Lowering their containers into the stream, they create a terrible clamor. At the noise, a malevolent serpent leaps from its deep lair. It can kill with fangs, fierce tail, or fetid breath. My dear friends, I'll be your avenger in death, or die with you. Blood begins to drip from the creature's venomous maw. The fresh grass stains crimson. Neck and tree are together pierced. Why, Cadmus, must you look at the snake you slew? Slipping through the sky, she stands by his side and orders him to plow the earth and plant the serpent's teeth. And so he does. The earth begins to move. From the furrows spring sharp spears and helmets with bright plumes. Then shoulders, torsos, and hands bearing arms, a martial crop of mighty men.
The goddess was bathing in her preferred waters. At the sight of him, the naked nymphs struck their chests. The nymphs surrounded Diana. She was without her arrows. Instead, she cast her water of revenge. Over the head she had drenched, she pulled the horns of an immortal animal, stretched his neck, sharpened his pointed ears, made his hands the same as feet, arms the same as legs, and clothed it all with a stag's spotted pelt. Tears streamed down a face that isn't his. Frozen in doubt, he sees his dogs, and they see him. Their snouts tear into his ill-fated flesh. Diana's fierce anger momentarily appeased. He casts his glance all around and shouts, "Come!" And she calls back, and she calls back, and she calls back, and she calls back, and she calls. "Why are you running away? Why are you running away? Why are you running away?" "Away," she seems to say. "Let's meet up here." She comes floating from the woods. "Away with your hands and hugs. Away with your hands and hugs. I'd die before I give you my power." An echo answers, "I give you my power." May Narcissus find love, but fail to be loved. There was a pool of water. While he sought to slake his thirst, another thirst takes its place. Through leaking light, Narcissus gazes at that false form and dies by the very sight. He owned an orchard whose foliage glowed with golden radiance and hid branches of gold and apples of gold.
Arboreae frondes auro radiente nitentes, ex auro ramos, ex auro poma tegebant.
May I stay here and rest?
Hospitium requiem quae peto.
But Atlas remembered the ancient oracle. Get out of here and quit lying about the glory of your deeds. Where's Jupiter now that you need him? At that, turning his back, Perseus thrust forth Medusa's squalid head. Atlas, huge as he was, morphed into a mountain, his beard and hair turned to forests, his shoulders and hands ridges. Where his head had been, now sits the summit, and his bones, stone.
Sumo est in montem cacumen, ossa lapis fiunt.
Arachne was famous for her art, not for her lineage or provenance. You could tell that she had learned from Pallas. But Arachne herself denied this. Let her challenge me. Foolishly confident and eager for victory, she tempts fate. They each ready their loom. With great effort, they deceive their fatigue. Each weaves in gentle golden thread. Neither Pallas nor envy could find fault with the girl's work. The golden-haired goddess raged at her challenger's success. 3, even 4 times she struck Arachne's forehead. The girl could not bear it and tied a noose around her courageous neck. Willful girl, you will live, but still shall hang. And so, touched by Minerva's poison, Arachne's hair vanished. And with it, her nose and ears. Her head shrank, her body shriveled up. In place of legs, willowy fingers stuck to her sides. Abdomen is all the rest. And with this, she spins her thread. Her woven web answers its ancient call.
Creverat opprobrium generis, foedumque patebat matris, adulterium monstri novitate miformis. Thus the queen's monstrous adultery was visible to all. Destinat hunc minos thalamo removere pudorem multipli. The king planned to imprison the beast in a serpentine lair with hidden chambers. Daedalus, the renowned architect, built the structure. He inverted the normal design and fooled the eye, confusing any onlooker with ambiguous, winding ways. Ducit in errorum variarum ambage viarum. Theseus killed the monster, et acteo bis pastum sanguine monstrum. Thanks to Ariadne, he found his way out, winding the thread she left him. Utque ope Virginea nullis iterata priorum janua difficiles philo est inventa relecto.
Daedalus was fed up with Crete and his long exile. Although Minos confined me both by sea and land, the sky stretches open overhead. I'll flee that way. He puts his feathers in order, first the shorter, then the longer. He fits those unknown wings to his son's shoulders and teaches the boy how to fly. The child delights in his reckless flight, fascinated by the open sky, flies higher. The sun's rays were now very near, rapidly melting the fragrant wax that fastened the feathers. Daedalus cursed his skill and buried his son's fallen body in a tomb.
Seeking shelter and respite, they visited 1,000 homes, and 1,000 doors were slammed shut. But one welcomed them. He set out a chair and bade them to lighten their load. She offered olives of various hue. They had one goose, guardian of their humble haunts. They prepared to kill him in honor of their divine guests. But the gods forbade it. Leave your hut and come in our company to the top of that towering peak. They were just as far from the summit as an arrow can fly from a bow. When they looked down and saw waters washing over everything, except their humble home. That house of theirs, that had been tight even for two, was transformed into a temple. We beg to be your priests and protect your sanctuary. And since we have always shared each other's embrace, may death snatch us both at the selfsame hour. Their prayer was heard. Talking of the years gone by, Bacchus saw Philemon grow leafy, and Philemon too spied Bacchus covered in bark. Together they cried, "Goodbye, my dear," as tree trunks sealed their lips.
At first, she did not recognize the fires of love. Often she embraced her brother and planted kisses on his neck. It did not seem wrong to her. Gradually, her love became more lascivious. Awake, she banishes indecent thoughts from her mind. But in soothing slumber, her fantasy takes form. I must confess my mad love. She begins and then wavers. She writes, then curses what she wrote. She starts again, but waffles, editing, critiquing, approving. She picks up her pad, then places it down. She finishes her letter of shame. O most faithful servant, take this to my... and adds after a long pause, brother. Numb with anger, her brother hurls aside the half-read letter. He flees his native land and her illicit love.
Orbe locus medio est, inter terrasque fretumque, caelestusque plagas, triplicis confinia mundi. There is a place in the middle of the world, between earth and sea and the expanse of sky, where all three meet. Fama tenet. Rumor lives here. She built that house with innumerable entrances, added a roof open in 1,000 places, with nary a door to be seen. Atria turba tenet, veniunt leve vulgus, euntque. A mob throngs its halls, a capricious crowd comes and goes. Illic credulitas, illic temerarius error, vanaque. Here is credulity, reckless error, unfounded joy, alarming fears, sudden dissension, mendacious murmurings. Rumor herself sees all that is done in heaven, on land, and at sea. She eavesdrops over the whole world. Videt totumque inquirit in orbem.
So great was his hatred of tyranny that he chose voluntary exile. He was the first to decry eating animals.
The earth is generous with her wealth and provides bountiful treasure.
What a wicked thing for flesh to feed upon flesh. Don't you see your souls in theirs?
Nothing ever dies.
Our souls can lodge in wild beasts and dwell in the hearts of herds.
It would bring us shame not to protect and shelter creatures that might house the souls of our parents, our siblings, our fellow man. Feed only from that which ripens.
Actually, I received a very touching letter from the wife of the man who started the Latin library, whose text is in the book. So the way the book is laid out, there's the line of text. So just in case this is totally unclear, Ovid wrote quite a lot, and I took select lines from each of the stories, so it's very, very condensed, distilled. And then from those lines, those are the ones that are paired and Andrew translated. But then I decided to include the full Latin text in the layout. And that all comes from this Latin library, Bill Carey, who is actually, his health is no longer or he's not well, so his son is taking it over. And anyway, his wife wrote a very nice note saying, like, just that they have friends in Chile and they haven't been, and this was a wonderful way of visiting, and thanks for using my husband's passion. He's actually a medical malpractice lawyer, and then started this incredible resource, and it's his true love is Latin. So.
My suspicion is the overwhelming majority are Greek in origin, and if there are any that are only Latin, they're relatively few. Ovid, like most literate Romans of the first century, would have been bilingual in Latin and Greek, so he had access to those Greek poetic traditions in the original.
So one of the really interesting things about this entire project, of which there are just a gazillion, is that these photographs were taken in a very different time in my life under different circumstances, and to have them kind of become something in this language, there have just been lots of surprises. So one of the stories in here, and I should mention, we showed 12 stories tonight, and there are 29 in the book. But one of them was of Arachne. And it wasn't until after doing the entire book, came out in May last year, so like about a month later, I realized, holy shit, Arachne, the woman who kind of becomes her, her name's Letty, and she, like, this is her work. So the woman who becomes the weaver actually is a weaver who sent me home after spending this whole weekend with her and her family with, like, basically the web that she wove. So I took it out, and I wanted to wear her web tonight. Yeah, so, and that was unbeknownst, and somehow, I don't know. There's a con man also that I fell for, who appears in the story in one of the most vicious stories. Tereus, Procne, and Philomela. Yeah.
Well, I love Kate's remarks about the sweater, because it reminds me of what is so magical about this collaboration and this performance tonight. There's obviously many levels of translation happening. There's Kate interpreting Ovid, there's me translating Ovid into English, and then there's, of course, Justin interpreting musically what Kate and I are doing visually and verbally, and we have an ASL translator, and we had Andy doing video work, and at one point Kate was taking a picture of Andy videoing Justin's music, and all of these various interactions and collaborations almost overwhelmed me in their multiplicity and majesty, because working one-on-one with Kate was an incredible life-altering experience, but it feels like it was just amplified by a factor of 10 or 15 in this room tonight. So thank you all for being a part of that and providing a container in which that could transpire.
I have a question for you. Do you want to speak about the first line of the book, of the story, Ovid's very first line? Do you feel like diving into it?
Sure. It's almost like translating when in the course of human events, or to be or not to be. It's been translated so many times and so well. And I am a professor of Jewish and Renaissance history at the University of South Carolina who has no real credentials as a Latinist and as a translator. And one of the amazing things Kate did for me as a person, and I think for us as a collaborative duo, was to really encourage me to just let go. And I have known Latin in some way or another since 7th grade, when I started taking Latin, and I adopted the name of Orpheus in my 7th grade Latin class. Didn't show it tonight. You didn't know that. And so I'm a scholar and a philologist, and engage in what my wife affectionately calls high nerdery very often. I try to read Latin every day, and I wake up every morning and read Greek, and I also try to do some Hebrew every day, so this is all very dorky. And part of that training means I feel bound by conventions of grammar that Kate freed me from. Latin loves passive voice constructions, and most of us were probably taught in school to not use the passive voice. So there's this one particular construction in Latin called the ablative absolute, which usually sounds like this in English. After having seen her depart, overwhelmed by the grandeur of her expression, and that's just very stuffy to me. And Kate, it must be said, a lot of the language that you heard tonight wasn't me out of whole cloth, that was Kate and I working together. And so with regard to this first line that has been translated hundreds of times into English, Kate and I were just dialoguing about it over and over again, and I came up with imagination manifests transformation, which, let me be clear, is not accurate to the Latin, but I'll share with you one little insight. The fourth Latin word of that opening is animus. And anyone who's had first-year Latin may remember there are two very similar words in Latin, animus and anima. And if you've studied any Romance language, you know probably that animus is masculine and anima is feminine. And animus typically means something like intellect, intelligence, ratiocination, reason.
And anima means something like the soul or feeling, and it's very gendered in a problematic way for us in 2022. And Kate and I were talking about it, and I didn't like the fact that animus had to represent the cold, the rational, the scientific, and anima was the realm of the soul and imagination. So that was my little subversive tweak, to say that animus could really be something imaginative and not necessarily coldly calculated and rational.
That's fun. Yeah, because I remember you balked at other translations who have sort of said, like, my soul sings of change of forms or something, but it's like, but it also just feels like that is the spirit of the entire project, is that imagination manifests transformation. So we're imagining, you know, something that was other and can be both and then we just play that game over and over again. Yeah, it was a very simultaneous process. So I had already started looking at the images. There was a chance that we were going to go to Chile, and I hadn't dealt with these images for 20 years. David suggested, that was a time of change. I have an interest in Metamorphoses already, and what would it be like to read Ovid and see if there's a relationship there. So it was a simultaneous process of really just going through the contact sheets and reading through the stories, the myths, in English. I was using Alan Mandelbaum's translation at the time. And like it just does, it sort of bubbles, it fizzles, it has some sort of electricity that feels like, some of them are much more literal and some are not. Like there's the one of Action where it's a girl who has a baby stroller on top of her head, and I thought, well, that looks like a mask that's not your own, like but that one maybe stretches a little bit more. And for the most part, so there are a lot less negatives. I have about 1,500 negatives that I was working with. Ovid has 12,000 lines. And so it was actually kind of easy to, you're skimming through and like you see it or you don't see it. And that's how, in a way, these stories are, they're extremely universal. There have been artists and writers and filmmakers and poets through the centuries, the millennia, who have dealt with this material, this sort of, I keep thinking of that I've just stepped into this realm where we all have this root language that Ovid has provided. And because of that universality, like you would hope you had kind of aligned in 250 stories in like at least one of them. So we have like 10% where they're, and it's and another part, this isn't exactly what you're asking, but something that was really fun is that when I made the images, I would have edited them just in a terrible way. Like they would have, they had so much more in them than I would have ever been able to kind of bring out. And so like Narcissus and Echo, for example, those were rolls of film that I took when I was invited to go to a wedding by like, people who were a little bit older than me, but pot and marijuana was like circulating really freely, and I got high, and I double exposed several rolls. So if I didn't have a story that specifically has a character called Echo, and there's this call and response, and therefore there are these roles that have this double exposure where you're getting that echoing effect. These would have just never seen the light of the day, but in that case, the words teased out a new way of seeing that I wouldn't have otherwise. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's funny because I think I like the puzzle of it after the fact too much. So I I don't. I mean, I could walk around and start to see. I mean, I think I do that anyway. That sort of that I enjoy that one thing can be another thing. But I also selfishly, like, this was the really fun part, was that I could create this puzzle afterwards. So all of the components were there. It wasn't premeditated, but then I could just enjoy finding the solutions, and that those solutions were really subjective. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I need that constraint. The other way around, as you describe it, to walk around in the world and see Ovid would be just sort of overwhelming. Yeah. With Atlas, Percy and Atlas, I think I had like an image of a mountain, and then David knew that there was this other photograph of just this stone, this quarry, and that while like, for me, I learned that to include that in this description of his shoulders turning into the ridges and hair into trees and whatnot, and then to his bones into stone, that just holding on the stone was much more of an emotional relationship to what does it mean to actually turn into stone. So to have that photograph, I didn't go to it initially, but it taught me that, like, it contains in it much more weight than I gave it credit, or that I was hearing in the language. And then the other part is that, like, so while I was reading those stories, one word would pop out, and I would know that I had something that fit really well. But then I had to sort of find other images in order to make it work, so that I could have some semblance of the story. I mean, if you know a lot of these stories, I mean, it's so diluted that sometimes I get lost remembering what's the, like, how did this story work, because I've sort of taken them apart so much. So in that case, then I would have to fill in and find other images that, and other lines that allowed it to stay somewhat consistent. Narcissus and Echo, that happened a lot towards the end. Oh, that's nice. Yeah, like the collage aspects. Nice.
Yeah, and you're putting your finger on something that was another issue for Kate and me to deal with, namely, she had this other translation into English that she had read and that I think was her primary association with Ovid.
Right.
And so for a word like stone, that's not a big deal, because it's lapis, as you guys probably know, lapis lazuli. I'm not going to come up with a new word for lapis to be contrarian, especially if that's what's in Kate's eye. But there were times when she was leaning on Mandelbaum, and I didn't think that he served her images. So there was this interesting three-way dance between an old venerable translator, Kate's brilliant photographs, and my fumbling attempt to try to find new words that did service to the poet's intention and to Kate's photographic imagination. And it was a joy, but sometimes hard. Well, I was thinking about, which story is it with the briefcase at the end?
Oh yeah, so that's Deucalion.
Deucalion, excuse me. And I translated the word documenta, which is a plural, neuter, plural noun in Latin, into documents, which is totally wrong. And any Latin teacher would just cross it out. I forget what Mandelbaum had. He definitely didn't have that. Documenta means something like vestiges or evidence or proof or an indication. But because that figure in Kate's photo was holding a briefcase, it just seemed appropriate to use a word that had something to do with the briefcase. And that was a moment where, like, my 7th grade Latin teacher was living inside me, absolutely shaking with rage at me. But it was a moment of liberation, because I was doing something with Kate in dialogue with reference to her photos, and Mandelbaum was irrelevant.
Yeah.
That word was sort of strangely poetic.
It's like an oxygen, like a new kind of oxygen. and a kind of mischief. And yeah, it's a playfulness, it's a possibility. You know, I'm waiting for it to really piss somebody off. It's like,
May I add something?
yeah.
And I think for me, Jonathan, I mean, this isn't my project, it's certainly Kate's motivation to make these connections. But as this has evolved over the last 2 years, I've noticed the centrality of connections to this project. We underwent the translation during the lockdown phase of the pandemic. And then we did our first public presentation at a children's art space in a 400-person town in Washington State. And by the way, in her intro, when Kate mentioned that Maud and I were living in Washington, not DC, the state above Oregon, and in a 400-person town at that. And so we did our first public event in front of about 20 people in a children's art space. And then a subsequent event in New Mexico during the outbreak of, I think, the Delta variant, when we had to do it outdoors at a friend's house. And finally here now with Omicron in abeyance, we can do it at Site Santa Fe, and just 2 more people in a more elegant space with Justin's gear set up and with his amazing soundtrack. It just feels like more and more connections are being made, and it's incredibly inspiring.
Yeah, I just know that, like, it's nice to step into that there are these relationships. So, you know, the photographs were made during a time when I was looking at people like Cartier-Bresson or Helen Levitt, Eugene Atget, and then coming back and trying to edit them in that context. And so what I've learned, you know, through this project and analogies, as you reference, and also working with Robert Musil's The Man Without Qualities, is that I like that you can add a structure that will release you into some more liberated way of seeing. So it's like it's not done in the making of the images. There is this other kind of composting process, or metabolic process that I'm definitely into the photographs undergoing at this stage, and vice versa. I mean, engaging with mediums that, like, I wouldn't have anticipated. Yeah.
And Kate's comment just now reminds me of Anne-Marie's question. I don't know you, but I heard you speak, and Kate mentioned your name, and you asked about carrying Ovid inside of you. And I know that I do more now after having done this project. I know that Kate does, because I think she knows these myths better than I do. And in Renaissance Europe, which is my scholarly home, every humanist knew vast stretches of Ovid by heart. And the way they saw the world was through the prism of these classical poets. And they were always recombining and innovating by deploying Ovidian turns of phrase and entire sections to radically new ends. Quick example. Jewish and Christian preachers would often quote Ovid in their sermons on Genesis. Why? Because the very first story in Ovid's Metamorphoses is about the creation of the world. And this was a time when people's minds were really open, and they didn't see a tension necessarily between pagan antiquity and the Bible. They felt that the one could reinforce the other. So yeah, Anne-Marie, back to your comment about carrying Ovid around, I feel inspired by a distant past where not only people carried Ovid around, but they could use him as a lens through which to observe life and the past and the present. And it seems like that's what Kate has done to her own life.
Actually, another comment to your, Jess, that it's been interesting to get feedback from people who have spent time with the work, and that those words that I might have cued into aren't always the same, and so there's still like where I think it's so explicit that this is what we're meaning, there's still ambiguity, and there's difference of interpretation, and they're seeing something that I didn't mean at all. Yeah. Hi. No, I didn't come up with the idea. Actually, my partner David did. No, I mean, it's all quite organic. So yeah, the photographs were made when I traveled there after high school. and collected them, didn't know what to do with them when I returned. And they sat, and then there was a chance that we were going in 2019 to Chile, and I hadn't been back, I hadn't dealt with the images, and it all freaked me out. And so I started scanning them and just spending time with them, and then in conversations at the table, talking about what they might be, David cueing into that this was a time of great personal change and transformation in which I made the pictures, so being like leaving home, graduating high school, lots of change. And what would it be like to combine them with, or even just, I don't even how it worked out, but just look at them and look at Ovid, and then see what happens, and quite a lot happened. Actually, there were like these remarkable relationships grew out of the stories and the images. But I don't have a I don't have a background in Latin poetry or classical antiquity but very just being attuned to imagery, whether it's in a word or in a photograph. Yeah. I've really learned to love the people around me at that time more than knowing much about myself anymore about myself at that time. But I can sense that on one hand, God, I'm most fucking everywhere. It's like, a baptism here and a wedding there and like a sculpture conference over here, and it's like, what was going on? And in retrospect, I realized, it was just, I was 18, like in the Southern Hemisphere alone in a Latin country. Everybody's telling me to watch out, so they were watching out for me, and I was just drifting. I didn't have anywhere to be or anybody to be with, and so that I had just lots of people who took care of me. Is how I sort of see things now. Shuffled safely through the country and experienced incredible things, but also lends itself to why there's such a diversity of images and places and people and experiences, and how that lent itself to the stories as well. But yeah, I mean, I think she just said yes a lot. The making of the images, that has its own spirit that you're under the influence of, and so that person, that part of me, that she was just wide open, and that's an interesting part about being an image maker. It's very generous and very, it sees a lot. And I'm also like really, really grateful to the photographs. Like I feel like they're very animated in a certain way. I'm glad that they wouldn't let me touch them and mess them up. Not, it was the wrong kind of messing up until we got the right kind of messing with them. Yeah, so like in the making, I think she was able to listen, and then not until now kind of listen to them again in this format. Yeah. The con man, he did not make an appearance tonight. He's Terrius and Terrius Procne and Philomela. Yeah, it's a really brutal story, but he's not in there so much. I mean, I learned a lot from this con man, but also I lost my camera to him, but I had just finished the last roll and taken out that roll before he stole it. So that's why we even have a photograph of him. He's the last frame on it. And the fun part, I've shown this to friends, and one photographer in particular, he was just like, Jesus, you trusted that guy? It's like, he's doing like the Nixon piece. And but so he's not, for him actually, he wasn't, I didn't feel like he was malicious. I mean, Terrius is just a brutal, disgusting character. So he's not in that story so much for that reason, but for the reason that there's a moment of betrayal and distrust. Yeah, lack of trust. Yeah, but I was happy to have his photograph. Actually, he took a picture of me, and then, and it was all that kind of like testing. How far will she go? Like, will she let me hold her camera? Will she let me take it downstairs and never come back? Just like so, yeah.
We're happy to answer more questions individually or as we sign or after, so please do stick around.
And again, Justin, that was really beautiful. Yeah, this is the first time. Thank you.